Go. There are rude people everywhere there are rude people everywhere in stores, buses, roads, schools, places of business, walking down the street, your neighbors, and the list goes on. You can encounter these people while you're driving down the street. Being rude is, what does it mean to be rude? It's the disrespect and failure to behave within the context of a society or a group of people's laws. Being impolite, being offensive, basically using offensive language, using vulgar language, is considered acts of rudeness. A good example would be walking down the street. You say hello to someone, that person ignores you or walks past you like you're not even there. This is considered rude. Being treated rudely at a check counter, at the grocery store. A good example of that is the store checker doesn't acknowledge your presence, doesn't smile, makes little or no eye contact. That's acts of rudeness which you encounter every day. Swearing on the bus is an act of rudeness as well. It's considered rude. Being rude to people is not a crime. No, of course not, because if it was a crime, millions of people would be in jail. Every day you encounter rude, unfriendly, indifferent people. There are millions of acts of rudeness every day in this country. It's hard to make friends these days because we live in it, because people are cold, cruel, selfish, indifferent, rude, unfriendly, uncaring. We live in a technologically based society where computers control the way we communicate with one another. 7% of the US population is considered lonely, socially isolated, with no social bonds or friends. You can blame rude people for this. There are other acts of rudeness. There are other acts of rudeness, like, for example, making fun of people, ridiculing people, using obscene gestures. Racism can be an extreme form of rudeness. Racial slurs are also considered rude as well. If you have been to a big city like New York, people there are the most rudest, most unfriendliest, standoffish people around. Of course, any big or major city that meets this criteria, rudeness is a social disease. No matter where you go, you will encounter it, regardless. Most people that are rude are women. I've encountered it most of my life. I lived in the city with about 200,000 people, and it's some of the rudest people I've ever lived. It's one of the rudest cities I've ever lived in, besides Los Angeles. The women are there the women. Okay, I'll tell you where I lived. I mean, it's a city. It's the second largest city in Washington State. It's the women there are especially rude, unfriendly, stuck up. And I lived there for many years. I found that offensive at times, but you can't do nothing about that. You have to accept people for the way they are. Unfortunately, that's human nature. There are other acts of rudeness. There are other acts of rudeness, like, for example, Like I said, any act, anything that's offensive. Any offensive language can be considered rude. Like I said, making obscene gestures or cutting a person in line, which is considered rude, but I don't take that. I don't really look at that. I don't really consider that rude as much. The worst kind of rudeness is the silent treatment, being ignored. You go into places, people ignore you. Oh, they don't know you, that's just an excuse. That's just an excuse. I've dealt with that for years. And it won't change. People will not change regardless of what you think. You could say this country is one of the rudest, it's got the rudest, most rudest people I've ever seen, especially women. I know most people won't agree with that, but that's my personal opinion. I don't care what anybody agrees. I don't care if anybody agrees with me or not, but that's what I've experienced throughout my life. Even in small towns, you find the same thing. You'll find rude people everywhere, regardless. I don't care. I mean, what? I mean, I don't care how small of a population. I don't care if you live in a city of two of a million people or 10,000 people. It's the same thing. You're going to encounter people like this all the time. You're going to encounter rude people that have no lack no respect, have no manners for any, have no empathy for the next person. There are numerous acts of rudeness. There's many different acts. I'm not going to go through all these. There is just literally hundreds of different types of acts of rudeness. I mean, I'm not going to get into the details with it, but I've made my point very clear. Rudeness is an anti-American thing. To me, I consider rudeness anti-American in its